The encounter. The mining station floated in the cold void of space, silent except for the occasional hum of machinery. Jackson, a tall, rugged man with tired eyes, leaned back in his chair, sipping lukewarm coffee. He was used to solitude. Life on the station was predictable, dull even. It suited him. No surprises, no drama. Just the steady routine of extracting minerals and sending them back to Earth. Tonight, however, something felt off. The station's lights flickered for a moment. A rare occurrence, but not impossible in such an old facility. Jackson frowned, setting his coffee down. The power systems were supposed to be reliable. Then came the noise. A low, guttural hum reverberated through the station, followed by a sudden, piercing alarm. Unidentified life form detected at Airlock 7. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. The automated voice of the station's AI repeated the warning. He grabbed his wrench, his closest thing to a weapon, and headed to the airlock. The corridors were dimly lit, the red glow of emergency lights casting eerie shadows on the metallic walls. "What the hell is this?" he muttered to himself. The station was supposed to be isolated. No ships, no visitors, certainly no life forms. As he approached Airlock 7, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. The outer door was ajar, and frost had crept in along the edges of the walls, glistening like tiny diamonds in the emergency lights. His grip on the wrench tightened. Then he saw her, a figure slumped against the inner door of the airlock. She was humanoid but unmistakably alien. Her skin shimmered faintly, like moonlight on water, and her hair floated gently, as if caught in an unseen breeze. Her eyes, half closed, glowed faintly with a mesmerizing, starry hue. Jackson stared, unable to move. The alien girl struggled to lift her head, her movements slow and weak. Her lips parted, and she whispered something in a voice barely audible over the hum of the airlock. "Help. Me." Jackson hesitated. He should call the emergency protocols, alert Earth Command. But something about her made him pause. She looked fragile, vulnerable. The glowing eyes met his, pleading. "Unidentified life form still present," the AI announced, breaking his trance. He shook his head, snapping back to reality. "Can you understand me?" he asked, his voice cautious. He took a step closer, keeping the wrench in front of him like a shield. The girl nodded weakly. "Who are you? What do you want?" He pressed, his voice firm. Her hand trembled as she raised it, pointing toward him. "Blood," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I need your blood." Jackson froze. His blood. Panic surged through him. Was she some kind of predator? He took a step back, his mind racing. He should run, seal the airlock, let her die out there. But then he saw the pain etched on her face, the desperation in her glowing eyes. She wasn't attacking. She was barely alive. "Why?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Why my blood?" She didn't answer. Her body sagged, and her eyes began to dim. Whatever was keeping her alive, it was fading fast. Jackson felt a pang of guilt. He didn't know why, but he couldn't just stand there and watch her die. Against his better judgment, he approached her. He didn't know what he was doing, but he couldn't ignore the voice in his head screaming at him to act. Grabbing a medical kit from the wall, he crouched beside her. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "But if you try anything, I'll—" He didn't finish the sentence. She was too weak to respond. Jackson used a sterile needle to draw a small amount of blood from his arm, his hand shaking the entire time. The crimson liquid gleamed in the syringe. He hesitated for a moment, then injected it into her arm. The alien girl gasped, her body arching slightly, as if electricity had surged through her. Her eyes shot open, glowing brighter than before. She stared at Jackson, and for a moment, he felt like she was looking straight into his soul. Then she spoke, her voice suddenly clear and fluent. "Thank you," she said. Her tone was calm, but her expression was intense. You have saved me, but I have taken more than you realize. Jackson frowned, confused. What do you mean? Before she could answer, the station lights flickered again, and the AI's voice interrupted them. Warning. Unidentified vessel approaching. Lockdown protocol activated. Jackson's heart sank. This night was only getting worse. He turned back to the girl, but her expression had changed. She looked terrified now. They're coming for me, she said, and they won't stop until I'm gone. Jackson gritted his teeth. He didn't know who they were, but he knew one thing for certain. His quiet, predictable life was over. The blood packed. Jackson's head pounded. He swore he could feel something shifting inside him, like a distant echo of a dream he couldn't quite remember. The alien girl, Kyra, she had called herself, was watching him intently, her glowing eyes reflecting the dim emergency lights of the station. You have saved me, she repeated, her voice now eerily steady. But I have taken more than your blood. Jackson's grip on his wrench tightened. He took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, to report this, to do anything but stand here like an idiot. But something in his mind hesitated, an unfamiliar feeling, as if something inside him was trying to understand her, even before she spoke. What do you mean? He asked, voice rough. His ira touched her temple as if trying to process a thought that wasn't entirely her own. I did not intend to. But when I took your blood, I absorbed more than nutrients. I took pieces of you. She blinked. Your language, your memories, your emotions. Jackson felt a chill crawl down his spine. Bullshit. But even as he said it, he knew something was wrong. The way she spoke now, clear, fluent, human. She had been barely forming words minutes ago. And now, she spoke like she had lived on Earth for years. His head throbbed again. Thyra flinched. I did not mean to steal, she said. It is my nature. My kind do not only feed on blood. We feed on knowledge, on understanding. Your species, it is so loud. Your thoughts, your feelings. I could not stop myself from taking. Jackson clenched his fists. This was too much. His quiet, isolated life had just shattered. A few minutes ago, he was just a guy trying to make it through another shift. Now, he was standing in a dimly lit corridor with an alien girl who had just stolen part of his mind. You're saying you have my memories. His voice was dangerously low. Zyra hesitated. Some. I do not see them like you do. They come in flashes, feelings, impressions. She closed her eyes for a moment. I know what coffee tastes like, even though I have never had it. I know the scent of rain on earth. I feel the weight of loneliness, though I have never been alone before. Jackson's blood ran cold. She wasn't lying. She couldn't be lying. You took that from me. Yes. A long silence stretched between them. Then the station lights flickered again. Warning. Unidentified vessel approaching. Lockdown protocol activated. Jackson cursed. He had almost forgotten about the bigger problem. Thyra's expression changed. Pure fear flickered in her glowing eyes. They have found me. Jackson narrowed his eyes. Who? The Xilari, she whispered. My own kind. They will not stop until I am gone. Something about the way she said it sent a deep instinctual alarm through Jackson's brain. Why? If they're your people, why are they after you? Zyra pressed a trembling hand against the wall, steadying herself. Because I am broken. Because I have changed. Jackson didn't understand, but he knew one thing. If someone was coming, he had to make a decision fast. He could lock her out, let whoever was after her take care of it, and pretend this never happened. He could go back to his life, back to the boring, quiet days. But when he looked at her, truly looked, he saw something in her expression that unsettled him, a deep, painful understanding. She wasn't just afraid of being caught. She was afraid of what would happen if they took her back. And then something strange happened. Jackson felt something shift in his mind, like a ripple across the surface of water. An image, not his own, flashed in his head. A vast, cold world, shimmering silver towers under a dark sky. Beings that moved with perfect grace, but without warmth. A suffocating, absolute silence. It vanished in an instant. Jackson stumbled back, breathing hard. What the hell was that? Zara clutched her head. I did not mean to. She stopped, her breath shaking. Some of me is inside you now. As I took from you, you have also taken from me. Jackson's mind reeled. This was too much, too impossible. And yet, it felt real. The station shuddered as a low vibration rumbled through the walls. The approaching vessel was close. Too close. Zara grabbed his wrist, her touch ice-cold. Please, she whispered. I do not want to go back. If they take me, they will erase everything I have become. Jackson stared at her. Everything logical in his brain told him to let her go. She wasn't his problem. He didn't owe her anything. But deep in his chest, something new stirred. A memory of her world, of its silence, its emptiness. He felt it now, not just in his mind, but in his soul. He couldn't let them take her. Jackson exhaled sharply and grabbed her hand. Come on, he said. We need to hide. Zara's eyes widened in shock, then softened. She nodded. As they ran down the darkened corridors, alarms blaring, Jackson knew one thing for certain. He had just made the worst mistake of his life. And maybe the best one, too. The forgotten truths. Jackson ran through the dimly lit corridors of the mining station. Zara's cold hand wrapped tightly around his wrist. The distant hum of the approaching ship vibrated through the walls like a slow drumbeat, a countdown to disaster. Every step they took, every turn they made, brought a rising sense of dread. What the hell was he doing? He didn't know this girl. She had stolen something from him, his memories, his emotions. And yet here he was, running to protect her from something he didn't even understand. They finally reached a storage bay, one of the deeper sections of the station, hidden behind thick layers of metal walls. Jackson punched in a security override, sealing the doors behind them. The lights flickered overhead, casting shadows across the crates and machinery. Jackson exhaled, pressing his back against the cold metal wall. His mind was racing. His body was drenched in sweat, but it wasn't just from running. It was from the strange, alien thoughts that weren't his own. Something was wrong with him. He rubbed his temples, trying to block out the overwhelming flood of emotions that didn't belong to him. He felt a sense of longing, a deep loneliness he couldn't explain. He missed something, someone. But it wasn't his memory. It was hers. Zara was watching him carefully, her glowing eyes filled with guilt. You feel it, don't you? She asked softly. Jackson looked up, his jaw clenched. Yeah, he growled. What the hell did you do to me? Zara hesitated, then knelt down beside him. It is not just my kind that takes, she said. You humans, you are different. When I absorbed from you, something happened that should not have. A connection was formed. You took something from me as well. Jackson glared at her. I didn't take anything. But you did, she insisted. You saw my world, didn't you? You felt what I felt. Jackson's breathing hitched. He had tried to push the memory away, but it was still there, a glimpse of her cold, empty world, a planet of silence, a race of beings who lived without emotions, without individuality. A prison. His head ached just thinking about it. You're saying we're linked now? He asked, his voice edged with disbelief. Zara nodded slowly. Not by choice, but yes, your memories, your humanity, they are inside me. And in return, I have given you pieces of what I am. Jackson let out a bitter laugh. Great. So now I have alien thoughts floating around in my head. That's just perfect. She flinched at the harshness in his voice. You do not understand, she said quietly. My kind, the Xilari, we are not like you. We do not feel things as you do. We do not dream. We do not love. Her voice wavered slightly. But I do now. Jackson's anger faltered. He could see it, the raw confusion in her expression. The struggle of someone experiencing emotions for the first time. A sudden sharp pain shot through his skull, making him wince. Another memory flashed through his mind. Not his. A vast, cold chamber. Rows of Silari standing motionless, their glowing eyes void of warmth. A figure standing in the center, looking up at a massive black monolith. And then, a command. Erase her. Jackson's eyes snapped open, his breath ragged. Zyra's hands were clenched into fists, her whole body trembling. You saw it, she whispered. He nodded. They're not just coming to take you back, he said, realization dawning on him. They're coming to erase you. Sarah swallowed hard. Yes, my kind believes I am. Contaminated. That I have become something that should not exist. Jackson stared at her. Because you have emotions now. Because I have choice, she corrected. Because I am no longer like them. And that terrifies them. A deep silence settled between them. Jackson felt his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He knew what this meant. There was no talking their way out of this. No negotiations. If the Xilari found her, they would wipe her from existence. The sound of doom. A loud boom rattled through the station, sending dust falling from the ceiling. The approaching vessel had docked. Jackson's radio crackled. Mining Station Delta 9. This is the Xilari Dominion. You are harboring an anomaly. Surrender it immediately. Their voices were emotionless, cold. Jackson's grip tightened around his wrench. His hands were shaking. This was insane. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a miner, a guy who had signed up for this job to get away from trouble. And yet, here he was, about to go against an entire alien race for a girl he had met less than an hour ago. You should leave, Zyra said suddenly. Her voice was quiet, but firm. They do not know you have been connected to me. If you walk out there now, they will not harm you. Jackson turned to her, surprised. You want me to just let them take you? She met his gaze, her glowing eyes full of something he had never seen before. Something human. I do not want to die, she admitted. But I will not let you die for me. Another boom. The outer door was breached. They were running out of time. Jackson clenched his fists. His mind was screaming at him to leave, to escape, to let this all be someone else's problem. But then he saw her, truly saw her, a girl who had never known love, who had never known what it meant to be alive until she had stolen a piece of his humanity. And he realized something terrifying. He couldn't leave her. Jackson exhaled sharply. I hope you're good at running, he muttered. Zyra's eyes widened. You are staying. He forced a smirk. Guess I'm not a fan of cold, emotionless bastards. Zyra's lips parted slightly. A small breath of something between shock and gratitude escaped her. The station shook again. The doors hissed as they started to open. Jackson grabbed Zyra's hand. Run. And they sprinted into the unknown. The silent enemy. The air was thick with tension as Jackson and Sarah sprinted through the dim corridors of the mining station. Emergency lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows that danced along the cold metal walls. Behind them, the distant hum of the Xilari ship had grown louder, a deep, rhythmic vibration that sent chills down Jackson's spine. They weren't just coming. They were already here. Jackson's boots slammed against the grated floor, his breath ragged as he stole a glance at Zyra. She was keeping pace, but barely. Her glowing eyes flickered erratically, her movements uneven. Whatever was happening to her, it was getting worse. Zyra, he hissed between breaths. You okay? She didn't answer right away. Then finally she nodded. I am changing. Jackson's stomach tightened. That wasn't exactly reassuring. Another deep boom echoed through the corridors, the sound of metal doors being breached. The auxiliary weren't wasting time. Jackson turned a corner, dragging Syra with him, and found himself in an old maintenance shaft. The space was tight, lined with thick pipes, the air thick with the scent of oil and dust. "Here," he muttered, yanking open a hatch in the floor. It led to the lower levels, where cargo holds and emergency shuttles were stored. He wasn't sure if they'd make it out, but he'd be damned if he just stood around waiting for those cold, emotionless aliens to erase her. Syra hesitated at the hatch. Jackson narrowed his eyes. "What?" She looked back toward the corridor they had come from, her glowing eyes filled with something Jackson didn't like, doubt. "I can feel them now," she whispered. "Their thoughts. Their purpose." Jackson gritted his teeth. "Then you know what they'll do if they catch you." She didn't move. "Syra," he snapped, grabbing her arm. She flinched and finally met his gaze. "Jackson, I should not exist." His stomach twisted. "What the hell does that mean?" Syra pressed a hand to her head. "I can feel it now. The way they see me. I am an anomaly. A mistake. The moment I absorbed your humanity, I became something that was never meant to be." She swallowed hard. "And I am dangerous." Jackson clenched his jaw. "That's bullshit. You don't understand." "No, you don't understand." He shot back. "They don't get to decide what you are. You're not a mistake, Syra. You're a person. You feel things now. You have thoughts of your own. That's what makes you alive." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue. But no words came. Another loud hiss filled the air. Jackson whipped his head around. The corridor behind them was no longer empty. The auxiliary had arrived. The silent enemy. They didn't walk. They glided. Their bodies were tall and eerily motionless, their long, featureless robes drifting around them as if they weren't bound by gravity. Their faces were smooth, expressionless, their glowing eyes devoid of anything human. They didn't breathe. They didn't speak. And yet, Jackson could feel them. A cold, creeping presence slithered through his mind, pressing against the edges of his thoughts like an unseen force. It was as if they were reaching inside him, searching for something. He fought to push it away, but it was like trying to fight the tide with his bare hands. Syra inhaled sharply beside him, trembling. "They are inside my mind," she whispered. "They are disappointed." Jackson swallowed hard. Disappointed. One of the auxiliary stepped forward. "You are incomplete." The voice didn't come from its mouth. It came from everywhere. A cold, collective presence, speaking directly into their thoughts. "You have tainted your form. You have absorbed corruption. You are no longer auxiliary." Syra closed her eyes. "I know." Jackson grabbed her wrist. "Don't." The auxiliary's glowing eyes turned toward him, and for the first time, he felt their attention shift. They were studying him. "You are the source," the voice echoed. "The contamination." Jackson clenched his fists. "If you're talking about emotions, memories, and free will, yeah, guess that's me." There was a moment of silence. Then, "You must be erased." Shit. Jackson's instincts screamed at him to run, but the auxiliary lifted their hands in eerie unison. A cold, suffocating pressure filled the room. It wasn't physical. It was mental, pressing down on his very existence. His thoughts grew heavy, his vision blurred. They weren't attacking him. They were removing him, like he was a stain on reality. Jackson gritted his teeth, fighting against the overwhelming force. But it was like his mind was being rewritten, his thoughts dissolving into static. Then, Syra moved. She let out a sharp gasp, her eyes flashing brighter than ever. "Stop." The force vanished instantly. Jackson collapsed, gasping for air. The auxiliary froze. Syra stepped forward, breathing hard. "He is not the problem," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I am." Jackson's head snapped up. "Syra, don't." "I am the mistake," she continued, ignoring him. but I refuse to be erased. The auxiliary tilted their heads, their movements unnervingly synchronized. You cannot exist. I do exist, she countered, and I will not let you take that from me. Something shifted. The air grew heavy. The auxiliary hesitated. Jackson's breath caught. This was it. The auxiliary had never encountered something like this before. They were a race of pure logic, of absolute control. But now, for the first time, one of their own was resisting. Thyra turned to Jackson. Her expression was firm. We need to leave. Now. Jackson didn't argue. He grabbed her hand, yanked open the hatch, and they jumped. As they tumbled into the darkness below, alarms blaring, Jackson knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was war. The chase begins. The descent was brutal. Jackson's body slammed against cold metal as he and Thyra tumbled through the narrow maintenance shaft. His fingers scrambled for something, anything, to grab onto. His boots scraped against the walls, sparks flashing in the darkness. Then, a sharp drop. He barely had time to brace before he hit the grated floor below, landing hard on his shoulder. A second later, Thyra landed beside him with unnatural grace, rolling to her feet like she had expected the fall. Jackson groaned, pushing himself up. His entire body ached, but there was no time to rest. Overhead, the station shook, a deep, unnatural tremor that sent dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The auxiliary weren't waiting anymore. They were tearing through the station. Thyra's glowing eyes flickered with urgency. They are adapting, she said breathlessly. They are recalculating their approach. Jackson wiped the sweat from his brow. Meaning? She turned toward him, her expression grim. They will not hesitate next time. They will erase us the moment we are found. Perfect. Jackson gritted his teeth and surveyed their surroundings. They had landed in an old maintenance bay, filled with rusting tools and crates that hadn't been touched in years. Across the room was a security console. Jackson sprinted toward it, his fingers flying over the old-fashioned touchscreen. A map of the station flickered to life, its glowing blue lines tracing the structure like veins. His heart hammered as he found what he was looking for. The emergency shuttle bay. Here, he muttered, pointing. It's 3 levels down, past the storage decks. If we can make it, we can launch one of the escape pods. Thyra studied the map, her eyes sharp. The auxiliary will anticipate that. Jackson exhaled sharply. Yeah, well, I don't see a better option. Thyra hesitated, then nodded. Then we move. Now. They took off, their footsteps barely audible over the distant hum of the auxiliary ship, which had now fully docked. Every corridor felt suffocatingly narrow, every doorway an invitation for an ambush. Jackson's instincts screamed at him to keep moving, to run. But something was happening. Thyra's movements were shifting. She wasn't just running, she was changing. Her glowing eyes flickered with something new, something sharp. Her breathing had steadied. Her posture was different. And Jackson felt it. Not in his gut, not in his mind, but somewhere deeper. The connection between them was growing stronger. She glanced at him as they ran, sensing it too. And in that instant, Jackson knew. She wasn't just absorbing his memories anymore. She was evolving. The silent hunters. They turned a corner and froze. The corridor ahead was no longer empty. 2 auxiliaries stood in the center of the passage, their forms as motionless as statues. Their featureless faces were turned toward them, their glowing eyes unreadable. No weapons, no words. Just pure, suffocating presence. Jackson felt it immediately. The pressure. A cold, relentless force pressing against his mind, trying to unravel his very existence. His thoughts blurred, his muscles locked. It was worse than before. They weren't just trying to erase him. They were rewriting him. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to resist. His every instinct screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. Then, She let out a sharp breath and lunged forward. And for the first time in his life, Jackson witnessed something impossible. She became like them. Her form blurred, moving with an unnatural grace, her body gliding instead of running. One of the Xilari lifted its hand, but it was too slow. Zyra reached out, her fingers brushing against its chest. And the Xilari screamed, not with sound, with thought. A sharp, piercing wave of raw emotion erupted through the corridor, an invisible shockwave that sent Jackson stumbling backward. The Xilari jerked violently, its glowing eyes flickering erratically. Jackson's breath caught in his throat. Zyra had done something. She had turned its own presence against it. The Xilari staggered, its form flickering like a glitching hologram. The other Xilari recoiled, shifting as if in fear. Jackson's mind reeled. The Xilari felt fear. He had never seen them hesitate before. Never seen them anything but cold, calculating, inhuman. But now, they were afraid of her. Zyra turned toward him, her breathing ragged. Run. Jackson didn't hesitate. They took off, leaving the flickering Xilari behind. But now, a terrifying thought burned in Jackson's mind. Zyra was evolving. She wasn't just resisting the Xilari. She was becoming something more. The final hurdle. They reached the shuttle bay. The large hangar stretched before them, filled with rows of escape pods lined against the walls. The emergency lights bathed the room in a dim red glow. Jackson's pulse pounded. They were so close. But before they could reach the nearest pod, a voice. Not from the speakers. Not from his ears. From inside his mind. You cannot escape. Jackson's blood turned to ice. He spun around, and there they were. 5 Xilari, standing at the entrance of the shuttle bay, their glowing eyes locked onto him and Zyra. No hesitation, no mercy. They lifted their hands as one. The air itself turned heavy. The pressure was unlike anything before, a crushing force that slammed into Jackson's mind, his thoughts fracturing into static. His knees buckled, his vision blurred. They were going to erase them, and this time, nothing would stop them. Unless Zyra stopped holding back. She took a shaky step forward, her eyes, burning white now, locked onto the Xilari. And then she whispered something so quiet, so alien, that Jackson barely understood. I am not you anymore. She raised her hands, and the station itself shook. A pulse of raw energy erupted from her body, a shockwave of pure, unfiltered emotion. For the first time in their existence, the Xilari screamed. Jackson's vision blurred, everything went white. And then, silence. The final stand. The silence after the blast was unnatural. Jackson's ears rang, his vision flickering as the world reassembled itself. He was on his knees, breathing heavily, his body weighed down by the sheer force of what had just happened. The air around him felt charged, electric, alive. And in front of him, she stood motionless, her hands still raised, her entire form pulsing with a soft, ethereal glow. Her eyes, once starry pinpricks of light, now burned with something far greater. They were no longer just reflections of the universe. They were the universe itself. Jackson's stomach twisted as he turned his gaze toward the Xilari. They were on the ground, all 5 of them. Their bodies, once pristine and composed, were now shaking violently, their glowing eyes flickering erratically. It was like they had been corrupted, as if something inside them was trying to break free but couldn't. Zyra had done something to them. Something permanent. Jackson forced himself to his feet, his hands clenched into fists. What the hell did you just do? He rasped. Zyra didn't turn to face him immediately. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step forward, toward the fallen Xilari. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was different. More human, more alien, more something else entirely. I gave them what they feared most, she said quietly. Jackson's pulse pounded in his ears. And what's that? Zara finally looked at him, and when she did, he saw it. The emotion in her eyes. They can feel now. A chill ran down Jackson's spine. The Xilari had always been cold, logical, precise. They were pure intellect without emotion. That's what made them so terrifying. They never hesitated, never doubted, never feared. And now, because of Tyra, they could. One of the Xilari twitched, its long, slender fingers clenching into a fist. It let out a slow, shuddering breath, its first breath. It lifted its head, glowing eyes meeting Xira's, and Jackson saw fear in them for the first time. "What have you done?" the Xilari rasped. Xira tilted her head. "I have given you what I was given." The Xilari's entire body shook. "We are not meant to feel." "And yet," Xira said softly, "now you do." Jackson exhaled sharply. This was too much. They had been fighting for their lives moments ago, and now Xira had done the impossible. She had forced an emotionless species to feel, and it was destroying them. One of the Xilari pressed a trembling hand to its chest, as if trying to contain something foreign, something it did not understand. Its glowing eyes flickered erratically, then narrowed on Xira. "This is unacceptable," it hissed. "You are a threat to existence itself." Jackson tensed. "Xira, we need to go. Now." She didn't move. "You still do not understand," she said, her voice calm. "You fear what you do not know, but you cannot stop it. You cannot erase it." The Xilari leader, if that's what it was, staggered to its feet. Its entire form rippled, like it was fighting against itself. "We must return. We must inform the collective." Jackson's gut twisted. "No, you really don't. If the entire Xilari species learned what had just happened here, if they knew that emotions could spread like a virus, they wouldn't just be hunting Xira. They'd be hunting every human in existence." Xira took a slow breath, then turned back to Jackson. "We cannot let them leave." Jackson's blood went cold. "You're saying we have to?" Xira met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "If they return to the collective, they will not just come for me. They will come for all of you. They will see humanity as the source of their corruption." Jackson swallowed hard. "So what's the plan?" Xira hesitated. "There is another way." Jackson didn't like the sound of that. "I hate that phrase." Xira stepped closer to the Xilari, who were still trembling, their glowing eyes full of something they had never experienced before. She lifted a hand, and for a moment, Jackson thought she was going to finish them off. But instead, she placed her palm against the Xilari leader's forehead. The alien jerked violently, its entire body shuddering. A pulse of energy radiated outward, sending a shockwave through the room. Jackson stumbled back, shielding his eyes from the light. When it faded, the Xilari were still. Jackson's breath caught in his throat. "Did you?" Xira turned back to him, her face unreadable. "They are not dead." He exhaled in relief. Then she added, "But they are no longer Xilari." Jackson's stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" Xira glanced at the motionless figures. "They will wake soon, but when they do, they will not be what they were. Their connection to the collective is severed." Jackson's mind reeled. "You just, what? Broke them?" Xira's expression darkened. "I freed them." Jackson didn't know what to say to that. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, he realized the truth. Xira wasn't just running from the Xilari anymore. She was changing them. And if they had feared her before, now she was their greatest threat. She turned back to him. "We need to leave. The others will come soon." Jackson let out a breath and nodded. "Yeah, let's get the hell out of here." They rushed to the nearest escape pod, the doors hissing open as Jackson scrambled inside. Xira followed, sliding into the seat beside him. Jackson slammed the launch sequence. The pod shuddered, then fired from the station, rocketing into the cold void of space. As the mining station shrank behind them, Jackson glanced at Tyra. "You're not just running anymore, are you?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "Now, I'm fighting back." Jackson exhaled sharply. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the auxiliary, or what Tyra was becoming. The pod vanished into the stars, leaving the broken past behind. But the war was only just beginning. The ultimate price. The escape pod drifted silently through the vast expanse of space, its thrusters flickering as it navigated the endless black. Inside, Jackson sat in the cramped cockpit, his hands gripping the manual controls. Tyra sat beside him, her glowing eyes fixed on the distant mining station, the place where everything had changed, where she had changed, where she had started something bigger than both of them. The station was still visible through the pod's viewport, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the auxiliary warship that loomed nearby. Jackson half expected an attack, for the ship to fire on them, to erase them from existence. But the auxiliary ship didn't move. It just hovered, watching. Jackson exhaled, rubbing his face. His whole body ached from the strain of fighting something he hadn't even understood. His mind felt stretched, frayed, as if pieces of him were still connected to something far beyond his reach. And then there was her. Tyra sat unnervingly still, her expression unreadable, her hands resting in her lap. She had been silent since they left the station, since she had severed the auxiliary from their collective, since she had changed them forever. Jackson turned to her. "All right," he muttered. "You want to tell me what the hell just happened back there?" Tyra blinked, as if she had just returned from somewhere else. "I set them free," she said simply. Jackson shook his head. "No, see, that's not what it looked like. It looked like you just shattered their entire existence." Tyra's fingers curled slightly. "Is that not what freedom is?" Jackson opened his mouth, then shut it. He didn't know how to answer that. Because, deep down, he knew she was right. The auxiliary had never known choice, never known fear, hope, doubt, love. They had existed in perfect control, connected to a vast, cold intelligence that dictated everything they did. And now, they were alone. Jackson wasn't sure if that was a gift or a curse. And what scared him even more, Tyra wasn't just running from them anymore. She was becoming something else entirely. Something even the auxiliary feared. The price of change. Tyra closed her eyes for a moment, her fingers twitching. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "Jackson, I am afraid." That stopped him cold. He had never heard her say that before. "You," he scoffed, trying to lighten the mood. "The girl who just rewired an entire alien species brain. You're afraid." She nodded. "Because I do not know what I am becoming." Jackson leaned back in his seat, exhaling. He ran a hand through his messy hair. "Yeah. Well, join the club." Tyra turned to him, something desperate in her expression. "I do not think this ends with me, Jackson." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. Then, "I can feel them," she whispered. Jackson's skin prickled. "Feel who?" Tyra's glowing eyes flickered. "The auxiliary. Not just the ones on the station. The entire collective." Jackson's breath caught. Wait. You're saying you're still connected to them?" Tyra exhaled shakily. "Not in the way I was before. But they are aware of me now. They know what I have done. They know I exist." Jackson felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. And what does that mean? Tyra closed her eyes again. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It means they are coming. No turning back." Jackson cursed under his breath, gripping the controls tighter. "Okay, fine. They're coming. Then we run. Again." Tyra slowly shook her head. You do not understand." She turned to face him fully now, and for the first time, Jackson saw something deeply human in her expression. Regret. Sadness. A kind of resignation that made his stomach twist. "Jackson," she said softly, "they will never stop. Not now. Not after this. I have done something that cannot be undone." Jackson's heart pounded. "So what? We fight. We figure something out. We." Syra reached out and placed a gentle hand on his cheek. And the moment she touched him, he saw the final truth. Images, flashes of future battles, of the auxiliary fleet stretching across the void, searching, hunting, entire colonies disappearing in the blink of an eye. The war was inevitable now. She had started it, and she was the key to ending it. Then the final image. Syra, standing alone in the heart of the auxiliary's world, surrounded by billions of them. Her eyes glowing, her presence unshakable. She wasn't just an anomaly anymore. She was a catalyst. She had the power to change them all. But she would not survive. Jackson jerked away, gasping. No, no way. Syra's expression was calm, but her eyes shone with sadness. "You see it now," she whispered. Jackson shook his head violently. "No, I don't accept that. We'll find another way." She gave him a small, knowing smile. "Would you have accepted it if you saw it in me?" He clenched his fists. His breath was uneven. "Don't do this." Syra slowly stood, stepping toward the escape hatch. "You gave me something I never had before," she said softly. "A choice." Jackson's vision blurred. "Then choose to stay." She exhaled. "If I stay, more will die." She reached up and touched his forehead. A warmth spread through his mind. A presence. Something permanent. "I will not be gone," she whispered. "Not entirely." Then she vanished. Jackson lunged forward, but he grabbed nothing but empty air. She was gone. The end, or the beginning. Jackson collapsed into the seat, his chest heaving. He felt like he had lost something vital, something he would never get back. Then the stars flickered. The auxiliary fleet arrived. Thousands of them. A warship bigger than Earth's moon appeared in the distance. Jackson's hands clenched into fists. His vision blurred, not with fear, with anger, with determination. Because he felt her. Somewhere, somehow, Syra was still with him. And for the first time in his life, Jackson was ready to fight. Not just for himself, not just for humanity, but for the girl who had stolen his blood and changed everything.